They taunted and humiliated the black hotel security guard, thinking he was just staff. But they had no idea what surprise awaited them. Subscribe to find out the whole truth and post in the comments where you're watching from. The luxurious beachside hotel stood as a symbol of prestige and opulence, where marble-clad halls and extravagant interiors catered to the whims of the world's elite. Its guests ranged from influential business magnates to renowned celebrities, all drawn by the hotel's reputation for impeccable service and exclusivity. Amidst this grandeur, a man named Marcus quietly performed his duties as a security guard, monitoring the comings and goings with a steady gaze and a composed demeanor. For several months, he had patrolled the hotel's grounds, observing the behavior of both guests and staff with a keen eye. To most, Marcus appeared to be just another member of the hotel's security team, a presence barely noticed by those who walked past. However, there was more to his story than met the eye. Unknown to the hotel's patrons and even most of the staff, Marcus was not merely a security guard. In reality, he was one of the hotel's owners, an influential figure within the network of luxury resorts. His decision to work undercover was driven by recent reports from employees who had confided in him about experiences of racial bias and discrimination. Marcus felt a personal responsibility to address these issues, and the best way to do so was to witness them firsthand. As the international conference drew near, preparations at the hotel intensified. Workers hustled to ensure everything was in place, from floral arrangements to technical equipment for the main event. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, but also tension, as staff faced increasing pressure to meet the heightened expectations of the prestigious event. Marcus could see it in their eyes, the anxiety, the fear of making even the smallest mistake that could jeopardize the hotel's reputation. He noticed that the scrutiny of employees seemed disproportionate, particularly toward the staff members of color. Black, Hispanic, and Asian employees were frequently subjected to harsher critiques and were more often reminded to maintain professionalism than their white counterparts. It was subtle but unmistakable, a sign that prejudice ran deeper than any policy of equality on paper. Marcus made mental notes as he observed these disparities, further affirming his resolve to enact real change. The day before the conference, the hotel staff exchanged whispers about the arrival of high-profile guests. Among the expected attendees was a wealthy businessman named Richard Whitman, known for his controversial comments and connections within the corporate world. His reputation for elitism and occasional outbursts of racist rhetoric preceded him, and there was an unspoken understanding among the staff to handle him with exceptional care. When the guests finally began to arrive, and it was a spectacle of opulence. Limousines and luxury cars lined the valet area, while doormen, bellboys, and concierge staff performed their duties with polished precision. Marcus stood near the main entrance, his posture upright, observing the steady flow of arrivals. He was dressed in the standard security uniform, a stark contrast to the tailored suits and designer gowns passing by. Though his presence was intended for safety, to some of the guests it was an unwelcome reminder of a reality they preferred to avoid. As Richard Whitman exited his car, he glanced in Marcus's direction, his face betraying a hint of disdain. "Well, I suppose even a place like this needs its safeguards," he remarked to his associate, his voice dripping with condescension. Marcus met his gaze but said nothing, maintaining a neutral expression. It was not the first time he had been on the receiving end of a subtle insult, and he knew it would not be the last. Inside, the atmosphere was no different. Several guests cast Marcus sidelong glances as they passed, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled disapproval. The underlying message was clear. Some believed that Marcus did not belong, that his presence somehow tarnished the exclusivity they paid for. He overheard snippets of conversation from a nearby group of businessmen who commented on the hotel's staffing choices. "Looks like they're letting just anyone work here nowadays," one of them said with a chuckle. "Standards seem to be slipping," added another, his voice carrying an air of superiority. Marcus continued his patrol, his outward calm masking the simmering frustration within. The whispered remarks and disdainful looks were nothing new, but their accumulation over time created a heavy burden. He had long grown used to disguising his reactions, not allowing any sign of emotion to slip through, but he could feel his patience wearing thin. The tensions within the staff were no less evident. That afternoon, Marcus overheard a supervisor reprimanding a black bellboy for being too slow in assisting a guest, while a white colleague who took even longer received only a light reminder. The bellboy, his face flushed with embarrassment, nodded silently and returned to his work. This was not an isolated incident, but rather a recurring pattern Marcus had noticed: the harsher judgment of minority employees and the unequal application of expectations. As evening approached, the lobby filled with guests preparing for the preliminary gatherings before the main conference events. Marcus's shift was nearing its end when a voice behind him called out, "Hey, you, security guy." He turned to see a middle-aged man with an impatient look on his face. "I got sand on my shoes while I was out on the terrace. Can you clean it off?" Marcus maintained his composure and replied, "I'm here to ensure everyone's safety, sir. I'm afraid that's outside my responsibilities." The man's expression hardened. "Safety? I'm a paying guest and I'm asking you to do something. I didn't realize the help around here was this unaccommodating." There was a hint of challenge in Marcus's eyes as he looked at the man. "I'm here to help with any security concerns you might have. For other matters, you may want to speak to a concierge or housekeeping." The guest scoffed, his face turning red with indignation. "You people think you're above doing real work, huh?" he muttered as he stormed off toward the concierge desk, where he complained loudly to anyone who would listen. As the man's voice echoed across the lobby, Marcus resumed his duties, but the incident left a bitter taste. He was all too familiar with the assumptions behind those words. "You people." It was not just an insult to his professionalism, but a reminder of the deeper bias that permeated even a place as glamorous as this hotel. By the time Marcus clocked out for the night, he had already made up his mind. He would not merely endure the conference as an observer. He would take action, collecting evidence of every act of bias and inequity he encountered. The injustices he witnessed, both overt and covert, would be brought to light, and those who perpetuated them would have to answer for their actions. For Marcus, this conference would not just be about wealthy individuals discussing business deals and sipping champagne. It would mark the beginning of his efforts to unmask the prejudices hidden beneath the hotel's polished surface. The first day of the conference began with an air of anticipation and tension that permeated the hotel's grand lobby. Guests were gathered in small groups, mingling and discussing upcoming events, while the staff bustled about to ensure that every detail was perfect. Marcus, stationed near the main entrance, maintained a vigilant presence, scanning the room with a practiced eye. He knew that for many, his uniform represented a divide between them and the real world, a barrier designed to keep them safe from whatever unpleasantness they believed lay beyond the hotel's pristine walls. It wasn't long before Marcus's suspicions about the guests' attitudes began to manifest. A group of businessmen, dressed in expensive suits and standing near the entrance, noticed him. Their conversation turned toward him, though they did little to disguise the fact that he was the subject of their discussion. "Well, I guess even the best places have to hire anyone these days," one of them said with a smirk, his voice loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Yeah, it's all about diversity quotas now, isn't it?" another added, shaking his head with feigned disappointment. Marcus kept his face neutral, not reacting to their words. He was used to such comments, though that did little to lessen their sting. These men were the embodiment of the attitude he had encountered so many times, the unspoken belief that his presence, and the presence of others like him, somehow diminished the hotel's prestige. It was a mentality that equated blackness with inferiority, no matter the context. As the morning progressed, the dismissive glances and whispered remarks only grew more frequent. Marcus continued his rounds, doing his best to remain unaffected. His training and personal resolve kept his emotions in check, but deep down he felt the weight of each subtle act of disdain. Around midday, a confrontation occurred that pushed the boundaries of subtlety and veered into outright hostility. One of the wealthier attendees, a man named Henry Caldwell, a prominent CEO known for his sharp tongue and elitist attitudes, walked into the lobby, flanked by his entourage. As he passed by, his gaze landed on Marcus, and he paused, as if appraising him like one might evaluate a piece of furniture. "You there," Caldwell called out, his tone imperious. "Come here." Marcus approached with measured steps, his expression calm. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Caldwell looked Marcus up and down, his lips curling in a faint smirk. "You see, I've got an issue with the way you're standing around here. It's as if you think you're one of us." He glanced at his companions, who chuckled softly. "We're paying good money to stay in a place like this. I expect the staff to act like staff." For a brief moment, there was a flash of anger in Marcus's eyes, but he quickly suppressed it. "My responsibility is to ensure the safety of all guests, sir," he replied, his voice steady. "If there's a specific concern you'd like me to address, I'd be happy to assist." Caldwell's smirk deepened. "I'd be happy if you didn't act like you belonged here," he sneered. "You're security, nothing more. So why don't you stick to your role?" The moment was tense, and it felt like the entire lobby was watching. Marcus knew he couldn't afford to react in a way that might escalate the situation. "I understand, sir," he said, offering a polite nod before turning to walk away. However, before he could take more than a few steps, Caldwell continued, his voice louder this time. "These places are getting more and more ridiculous," he said to his entourage. "First, they hire security guards who don't know their place, and next thing you know, they'll be letting just anyone stay here." His words hung in the air, and Marcus felt the stares of others in the lobby following him as he resumed his patrol. He could hear the murmurs of agreement and see the dismissive glances. The implication was clear. Marcus was out of place, a blemish on the otherwise perfect environment of the hotel. The encounter with Caldwell was more than just a personal slight. It was a public display of the pervasive prejudice that existed even in the most luxurious of settings. Later that afternoon, Marcus found himself standing near the terrace where guests were enjoying a lunch break. He was scanning the crowd for any signs of trouble when he noticed a man gesturing toward him. It was Caldwell again, now accompanied by several other influential attendees, including Richard Whitman, the businessman known for his controversial statements. "Hey, you," Caldwell shouted, "get over here." Marcus approached the group, already sensing trouble. "Yes, sir. Is there an issue?" "Yeah, there is," Caldwell said, his tone mocking. I stepped outside for some fresh air, and now I've got dirt on my shoes. How about you make yourself useful and clean them off?" Marcus's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I'm here to provide security services, sir. For cleaning assistance, I'd suggest contacting a concierge or housekeeping." Caldwell's expression darkened, and his voice took on a condescending edge. "Are you refusing to do what a paying guest asks? That's not very good customer service now, is it?" Whitman, who had been listening in, decided to join the conversation. "You see," he said to Caldwell, "that's the problem with these places trying to fill diversity quotas. They end up hiring people who think they're above doing real work." The others in the group laughed, and Marcus could feel the heat rising in his face. He took a steady breath and replied, "I'm committed to doing my job professionally, sir. If you have concerns, you can direct them to the hotel management." As Marcus turned to walk away, Caldwell's voice followed him. "You people think you deserve special treatment just because you're given a job," he muttered. The words were soft enough to go unheard by many, but loud enough for Marcus to catch. The weight of the phrase, "you people," hit Marcus like a physical blow. It wasn't just an insult to his professionalism, it was a dismissal of his very humanity, a reminder that, in the eyes of some, no level of accomplishment or dignity could shield him from prejudice. Returning to his post, Marcus's thoughts raced. He had known that he would encounter bias when he first took on this role, but experiencing it so openly, in such a refined setting, made it all the more egregious. The discrimination wasn't just directed at him, it was a systematic issue that affected anyone in the hotel who didn't conform to a particular appearance or background. As the day wore on, the incidents continued to accumulate. Marcus saw a black bellboy chastised by a supervisor for taking too long to carry a guest's luggage, while a white colleague received a simple reminder for a similar delay. A Hispanic housekeeper was told by a guest to stick to cleaning when she tried to assist him with directions. Each instance, though different in severity, added to a growing picture of a culture where bias and discrimination were tolerated, if not encouraged. That evening, after his shift ended, Marcus knew that he could no longer merely observe these acts of injustice. The conference was just beginning, and with it, a prime opportunity to gather concrete evidence of the unfair practices he had witnessed. The whispered insults, the public humiliations, the unequal treatment of staff. They were not isolated incidents but symptoms of a larger problem. Marcus returned to his room and began writing a detailed account of the day's events. He listed each discriminatory remark, each biased action, and each moment where prejudice reared its head. As he wrote, he formulated a plan. He would collect every piece of evidence he could, document every incident, and compile it into a report that would be impossible for the hotel's management to ignore. His goal was not just to protect himself, but to shine a light on the inequities that were so deeply entrenched within the hotel's culture. He knew that when the time came, he would be ready to confront the people responsible, armed with the truth. And while Marcus anticipated resistance and denial, he was more determined than ever to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for every employee who had suffered in silence. This was only the beginning, but Marcus was prepared to see it through, regardless of the cost. The second day of the conference brought with it a sense of unease that lingered over the hotel like a dark cloud. Marcus, though maintaining his usual calm exterior, could feel the tension in the air. The previous day's incidents had left a bitter taste, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before the situation escalated further. He was right. By midday, the lobby was bustling with activity. Guests moved about, discussing business deals and attending various conference sessions. The hotel staff worked tirelessly to accommodate every request, from arranging private meetings to delivering special orders to rooms. Amidst the controlled chaos, Marcus remained at his post, his eyes scanning the lobby for any signs of trouble. It wasn't long before trouble found him. As Marcus was making his rounds near the entrance to the hotel's elite sports club, he noticed a commotion developing just beyond the glass doors. Two men, both guests at the conference, were standing close to each other, their voices raised in a heated argument. Marcus could see from their expressions and body language that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. He immediately approached the scene, ready to intervene. The two men, both middle-aged and dressed in expensive athletic gear, appeared to be arguing over the use of a private tennis court. One of them, a well-known professional athlete, was adamant that the court had been reserved for him, while the other guest insisted that it was supposed to be available for everyone. As Marcus stepped closer, the athlete turned to him with an expression of annoyance. "You there," he said sharply, pointing at Marcus. "Get this guy out of my way. I've reserved this court for the entire day, and he's refusing to leave." The other guest, who seemed equally aggravated, cut in. "This is ridiculous. I've been coming to this hotel for years, and I've never seen a private reservation on this court. I'm not moving." Marcus positioned himself between the two men, holding up his hands in a gesture meant to de-escalate the situation. "Gentlemen, please, let's stay calm. I'm sure we can resolve this without any further disagreement. I'll speak with the concierge to clarify the reservation details." But the athlete, his face flushed with anger, would have none of it. "Are you kidding me? I don't need you to clarify anything. I need you to do your job and get him out of here." He gestured dismissively at Marcus, as if to emphasize his supposed authority. "That's what you're paid for, isn't it?" The other guest snorted in derision. "Looks like even the security here doesn't know how to do their job properly. What a joke." Marcus's patience was wearing thin. He had encountered disrespect before, but the open hostility and demeaning tone were pushing his limits. Still, he maintained his composure. "I'm here to ensure the safety of all guests," he said calmly. "Let me take care of this." Before Marcus could continue, the athlete suddenly shoved him, causing Marcus to take a step back. "Get out of my way, or I'll have you thrown out myself," he spat, his eyes flashing with fury. The scene was already drawing the attention of several other guests who were nearby. A few of them pulled out their phones to record the incident, while others whispered among themselves. Marcus felt the weight of the crowd's gaze upon him. He knew that how he responded in this moment would be crucial, not just for his own sake, but for the other staff members who might one day find themselves in a similar position. Marcus took a steady breath and stood his ground. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to refrain from physical contact," he said, his tone firm but controlled. "We can resolve this matter through proper channels." The athlete's expression twisted with disdain. "Refrain from physical contact," he repeated mockingly. "What are you going to do? Call the police on me? Or maybe you think I'm going to listen to you because you're wearing that uniform?" His voice grew louder as he addressed the growing crowd. "This is exactly what I was talking about yesterday," he said, casting a glance at the other guests. "Places like this are going downhill because they hire people who don't know their place." Marcus could feel the anger rising within him, but he knew he couldn't allow it to dictate his actions. "I'm here to help resolve the situation peacefully," he reiterated, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "Let's step aside and discuss this with management." At that moment, a hotel supervisor arrived accompanied by a concierge. The supervisor quickly assessed the situation and, without speaking to Marcus, turned to the athlete. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir," she said with a strained smile. "We'll make sure that your reservation is honored, and you can have exclusive use of the court." The other guest looked on incredulously. "So, that's it? You're just going to let him push his way around?" The supervisor's gaze flickered toward Marcus, then back to the athlete. "Please understand, sir, we value all of our guests and will ensure that you're accommodated as well," she said, her tone diplomatically neutral. Marcus felt a sharp pang of frustration. The supervisor hadn't even asked for his account of the events. She had immediately sided with the athlete. It was clear to him that this was not just a matter of keeping a VIP guest happy. It was a reflection of a deeper bias that favored those with wealth and status over fairness. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus caught sight of Caldwell and Whitman, the two men who had insulted him the previous day. They stood at a distance, watching the scene unfold with a look of satisfaction on their faces, as if they had been entertained by the spectacle. Caldwell met Marcus's gaze and gave a mocking little wave before turning away. After the incident, Marcus was summoned to a private meeting with the hotel's management team. The supervisor, the head of security, and the general manager were present. As soon as Marcus entered the room, he could sense the atmosphere was not in his favor. "Marcus, we've received some concerning feedback about your interaction with the guests earlier today," began the general manager, his tone deliberately measured. "It appears that the situation could have been handled more smoothly." Marcus listened in silence, knowing that any response could be construed as defensiveness. He could feel the scrutiny from the others in the room. "I acted within my responsibilities as a security officer," he replied calmly. "The guest was physically aggressive, and I was attempting to de-escalate the situation." The supervisor leaned forward. "There's a fine line between de-escalating a situation and making a guest feel uncomfortable," she said. "Our priority is to maintain a welcoming environment for everyone, especially during a high-profile event like this." Marcus could hardly believe what he was hearing. It was as if the athlete's behavior, pushing him and causing a scene, was somehow his fault for not allowing the guest to do whatever he pleased. "I understand the need to ensure the comfort of our guests," he said, keeping his voice even. "But I also have to ensure that conflicts don't escalate to the point where they threaten the safety of others." The general manager gave a small nod. "We're aware of that, and we appreciate your dedication to maintaining safety. However, we need to avoid situations that can potentially embarrass our high-profile guests." The implication was clear. Marcus's role was to protect the image of the hotel and to do so without challenging the behavior of its wealthiest patrons. He was dismissed from the meeting with a warning to be more discreet in future situations, a word that seemed to imply that his real duty was to turn a blind eye when certain guests stepped out of line. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his room, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The double standard was obvious. A wealthy guest could shove a security guard, insult him, and even draw the attention of other guests. Yet it was Marcus who was being reprimanded for not being discreet enough. The incident had laid bare the toxic hierarchy within the hotel, where wealth and status afforded one the privilege of being above the rules. He knew that he needed more than just witness testimonies and personal accounts to expose the bias that permeated the hotel's culture. It was time to take more decisive action. He began formulating a plan to gather undeniable evidence recordings, documentation of incidents, and statements from other employees who had experienced similar situations. If management was willing to ignore misconduct to appease wealthy guests, Marcus would ensure that the truth was impossible to ignore. The stakes were higher now, but Marcus was more resolute than ever. He would not allow the discrimination he and others faced to be dismissed or covered up. He was determined to bring the issue to light, even if it meant challenging some of the hotel's most powerful patrons. For him, this was no longer just about doing his job. It was about standing up for what was right. The third day of the conference dawned with a sense of quiet determination for Marcus. He had spent the night carefully planning his next moves. It was no longer enough to simply endure the mistreatment and biased attitudes he had faced. He was now on a mission to gather concrete evidence that could expose the prejudice festering within the hotel. The recent incidents had convinced him that systemic issues were deeply embedded, and he was ready to take action. As he resumed his duties, Marcus began discreetly recording interactions that he witnessed or was a part of. He carried a small audio recorder in his pocket, capturing comments from guests and staff that revealed the true nature of the hotel's discriminatory culture. These recordings, he knew, would be crucial in proving that the bias was not limited to a few isolated incidents, but was instead a pervasive problem. Throughout the day, he made it a point to check in with other employees who had experienced similar situations. He spoke with the black bellboy who had been reprimanded unfairly, the Hispanic housekeeper who had been told to stick to cleaning, and several other workers who had quietly endured mistreatment for years. Their stories were similar to his own: consistent patterns of disrespect, unequal treatment, and favoritism towards wealthy guests, particularly those who were white. One of the bellboys confided in Marcus about an incident that had occurred the previous year when a high-profile guest had berated him for failing to deliver a package on time. Despite the guest's rude behavior, the bellboy was the one who received a formal reprimand. The housekeeper shared that she had been spoken to dismissively by the same supervisor who had chastised Marcus during the confrontation in the sports club. These conversations only strengthened Marcus's resolve. He saw the frustration and hurt in the eyes of his colleagues and knew that they were counting on him, even if they didn't say it outright. During his lunch break, Marcus found a quiet spot on the hotel's rooftop terrace to review the recordings he had gathered so far. The audio clips were damning, capturing not only the words, but the tone and condescension in the voices of those who had treated him and others unfairly. He could clearly hear the athlete's taunting voice from the sports club incident, the dismissive remarks from Caldwell and Whitman, and even some offhanded comments from the supervisor about handling troublemakers. He needed to take his plan a step further. Gathering recordings and testimonies was a good start, but he would also need documentation that showed a pattern of discriminatory actions from management. He would need to prove that the hotel's policies were not applied consistently, and that there was a clear bias in how guests and employees were treated. Marcus approached a trusted coworker in the Human Resources Department who had been discreetly sympathetic to his cause in the past. He cautiously inquired about accessing records of guest complaints, employee reprimands, and other documentation that might help establish a pattern. The coworker was initially hesitant, fearing repercussions, but eventually agreed to provide some of the information under the condition that Marcus's name would not be mentioned. The records revealed a disturbing trend. Reprimands and disciplinary actions were overwhelmingly directed at employees from minority backgrounds, while similar behaviors from white employees resulted in little to no consequences. Furthermore, guest complaints that came from people of color were often dismissed or labeled as unsubstantiated, whereas complaints from white guests were treated with the utmost seriousness, often leading to immediate action against the employees involved. Marcus carefully documented these findings and cross-referenced them with his recordings and testimonies. He knew that he was building a case that would be difficult to refute, but there was still one more step he needed to take. He had to gain the support of key allies who could lend their voices to his cause. He arranged to meet with a few of the hotel's longtime business partners and vendors, individuals who had a significant stake in the hotel's reputation. Marcus chose his contacts carefully, targeting those who he knew valued fair treatment and would not be easily swayed by the hotel's prestige. During these meetings, he cautiously disclosed some of the issues he had observed without revealing his full plan. To his relief, several of the partners expressed concern about the potential impact of these problems on their business relationships and agreed to support his efforts if he could provide undeniable evidence. By late afternoon, rumors began circulating among the staff that an important meeting was scheduled for the next day. The hotel's owners and senior executives would be present, and it was clear that the purpose of the meeting was to address the escalating tensions that had arisen during the conference. Marcus knew that this would be the moment he had been preparing for, the perfect opportunity to present his findings and confront the discriminatory practices that he had been documenting. As the day drew to a close, Marcus noticed that the atmosphere around the hotel was different. There was a sense of unease among the staff, and he could see the nervous glances being exchanged in the break rooms and service corridors. Word of his activities had spread, though not in detail, and there was a palpable fear of what might happen if his allegations were brought to light. Some staff members, particularly those who had witnessed the confrontations involving Marcus, offered quiet words of encouragement or simply nodded in support as they passed him. That evening, Marcus met with the small group of employees who had shared their experiences with him earlier. They gathered in a private room away from prying eyes to discuss the upcoming meeting. Marcus shared some of the evidence he had collected, and the group agreed that they needed to stand together. Each person was prepared to speak up if necessary, despite the risks. However, there were still a few individuals within the staff who had aligned themselves with management, either out of loyalty or self-preservation. Marcus was aware that his actions could provoke retaliation, but he was prepared to face whatever came his way. His goal was not to create chaos, but to force the hotel's leadership to acknowledge the reality of discrimination and to take meaningful steps toward reform. The night before the meeting, Marcus went through his evidence one last time, arranging it into a comprehensive presentation. His documentation included not only the recordings and records of unfair disciplinary actions, but also emails from certain supervisors that contained racially insensitive language, or revealed a clear double standard in how issues were handled. As he organized his materials, Marcus couldn't help but think about how this confrontation might unfold. There was a good chance that the hotel's executives would try to downplay the issues or shift the blame onto lower-level management. He anticipated that some of the guests who had mistreated him would deny or dismiss his claims, possibly even using their influence to pressure the hotel into disregarding his evidence. But Marcus was determined. He had already endured too much to back down now. He was not just doing this for himself, he was fighting for the dignity and respect of every employee who had been treated as less than because of the color of their skin or their social status. He knew that there were people who believed in what he was doing, even if they were too afraid to say so openly. Before going to bed, Marcus wrote a final note to himself, a reminder of why he was taking this stand. Speak the truth, demand justice, don't let them silence you. As he closed his eyes, he mentally prepared for the confrontation that awaited him. Tomorrow, he would face the hotel's most powerful figures, and he would not walk away quietly. Whatever the outcome, Marcus was ready to fight for what was right. The morning of the meeting arrived, and a tense quietness hung over the hotel. Marcus woke early, reviewing the evidence he had painstakingly collected over the past days. His recordings, documentation, and testimonies from other employees were organized into a detailed presentation, ready to be unveiled before the hotel's most influential figures. Today was the day when all the biases, mistreatments, and discriminatory practices he had witnessed would come to light. As he entered the meeting room, Marcus saw that it was filled with people: senior executives, members of the hotel's ownership group, high-ranking management, and even a few key business partners. At the far end of the room sat the general manager, the supervisor who had reprimanded Marcus, and several other managers who had direct authority over the hotel's operations. Seated near them were some of the conference's prominent guests, including Richard Whitman and Henry Caldwell, whose names had become synonymous with trouble for Marcus. The atmosphere was one of mixed curiosity and apprehension. Few people in the room knew exactly why the meeting had been called, but many were aware of the tensions that had escalated throughout the conference. There were hushed murmurs as people took their seats, and all eyes turned to the front of the room where Marcus stood, waiting to begin. The general manager opened the meeting with a brief introduction. "We've called this meeting to address several concerns that have been raised regarding incidents over the past few days," he said, his tone formal and detached. "Mr. Marcus has requested the opportunity to speak, and we've agreed to hear him out. Marcus, you may proceed." Marcus took a deep breath and began his presentation. "Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to address everyone here today," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Over the past few months, I've been working as a security officer at this hotel. But what most of you don't know is that I'm not just a member of the security team. I'm also one of the owners of this hotel chain." A ripple of surprise swept through the room. The revelation was unexpected, and it instantly shifted the tone of the meeting. Several people exchanged shocked glances, while others looked at Marcus with newfound curiosity. "While working undercover, I've been observing how employees and guests are treated, particularly when it comes to issues of discrimination and bias," Marcus continued. "What I have witnessed is a pattern of behavior that cannot be ignored. The mistreatment and disrespect shown to staff members, especially those from minority backgrounds, are not isolated incidents, but part of a systemic issue." Marcus played a series of audio recordings that he had gathered, each one revealing discriminatory remarks and biased actions from both guests and staff. The voices echoed throughout the room. Whitman's condescending tone as he mocked the idea of diversity quotas, the athletes' taunts during the confrontation in the sports club, and even the supervisor's dismissive comments about handling troublemakers. The room was silent as the recordings played. The evidence was undeniable, and Marcus could see the expressions on the faces of those who had previously looked down on him. Whitman and Caldwell both shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces flushing with anger and embarrassment as their voices played back for all to hear. Marcus continued, presenting documentation that showed a clear pattern of unequal disciplinary actions taken against minority employees. "Here are records of formal reprimands given to staff members," he said, displaying the documents on a screen. "You will notice that nearly all of these reprimands were directed at employees from minority backgrounds, while similar behavior by other employees was overlooked." He showed emails that contained racially insensitive language, as well as records of guest complaints that had been dismissed or downplayed when they came from people of color. "The evidence speaks for itself," Marcus said, his voice rising with conviction. "We have a problem, and it is not just with a few individuals. It is a cultural issue that permeates the entire organization." The general manager, clearly caught off guard, tried to regain control of the situation. "Marcus, while these recordings and documents are concerning, I'm not sure they paint the full picture. We must consider context and—" Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp. "Context? The context is that certain guests and staff members have been allowed to behave in a manner that would never be tolerated if directed at those considered more important. The context is that our policies are not applied equally. The context is that the dignity of our employees is being compromised because we prioritize the comfort of certain guests over doing what's right." The room grew even quieter. For the first time, the managers and executives who had previously dismissed Marcus were listening intently. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, struggling to process the implications of what they were hearing. Marcus took the opportunity to introduce testimonies from other employees. Several of them had agreed to speak in support of his claims, and their recorded statements were now played for the room. One by one, they recounted their experiences of mistreatment and bias. The stories were powerful and consistent, revealing a pattern of favoritism and discrimination that was impossible to deny. As the testimonies concluded, Marcus delivered his final piece of evidence, the support he had garnered from several business partners. "I've spoken with some of the hotel's long-standing partners and vendors," he said, "and they are concerned about the impact that these issues may have on their business relationships. They have agreed to support our efforts to implement meaningful changes, provided that the necessary steps are taken to address the problem." There was a moment of stunned silence before the general manager spoke again, his voice tinged with irritation. "Marcus, I think we need to be cautious about making accusations that could damage the reputation of this hotel. We've worked hard to maintain a certain image, and we can't afford to—" Marcus cut him off once more, his voice unwavering. "The reputation of this hotel is already at risk because we've been ignoring the reality of discrimination. The time for protecting an image is over. It's time to protect the people who make this hotel run, the employees who have been overlooked, mistreated, and silenced for far too long." As the gravity of Marcus's words sank in, the room remained tense. The executives exchanged nervous glances, while some of the guests, including Caldwell and Whitman, whispered among themselves. It was clear that they had not anticipated such a direct challenge to the hotel's practices, nor did they expect Marcus to have the level of evidence he had presented. Finally, one of the senior owners stood up. She was an older woman with a reputation for being fair but firm, and her expression was one of deep concern. "Marcus," she said, addressing him directly, "the evidence you've presented is serious, and it requires our immediate attention. I think we can all agree that changes need to be made. We will begin a thorough review of our policies and practices, and we will involve external experts to ensure that we are addressing these issues comprehensively." The general manager tried to interject, but she raised a hand to stop him. "We can't afford to let these problems fester," she continued. "This is about more than just business. It's about doing what is right." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that the fight was far from over. There would be resistance, efforts to minimize the extent of the changes, and attempts to shift blame. But he had taken the first step, and the truth was now out in the open. As the meeting concluded, Marcus made his way out of the room. Several of his colleagues approached him, offering words of support and encouragement. Some thanked him for having the courage to speak up, while others expressed hope that real change was finally on the horizon. He noticed Whitman and Caldwell lingering near the exit, their expressions a mix of resentment and humiliation. Marcus met their gaze for a moment before turning away. He had no need for their approval. His actions had spoken louder than any insult they could hurl. Outside the meeting room, Marcus took a deep breath and allowed himself a brief moment to reflect on what he had achieved. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was prepared to continue his fight for justice. For the first time in a long while, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had not only stood up for himself, but for every employee who had been made to feel less than. Now, with the support of his allies and the evidence in hand, Marcus was ready to see the changes through. The revelation had only just begun, and there was still much work to be done. The fallout from the meeting was swift and profound. Word of Marcus's revelations spread quickly through the hotel, reaching every corner from the executive suites to the service corridors. For many employees, the news brought a mix of relief and hope. At last, someone had spoken up about the unfairness that had been quietly endured for so long. For others, especially those who had sided with management or kept silent out of fear, it was a wake-up call that things were about to change in ways they hadn't anticipated. The senior owner, who had supported Marcus's call for reform, wasted no time in initiating the promised investigation. External consultants were brought in to conduct a thorough review of the hotel's policies and practices. Their objective was to identify areas where discrimination had taken root and recommend necessary changes to create a fair and inclusive environment. This meant interviewing staff members at all levels, reviewing past incidents, and assessing how grievances had been handled. Marcus, now back in his role as one of the owners rather than an undercover security guard, continued to play an active part in the process. He sat down with the investigators and provided further details about the incidents he had documented. He also worked closely with the consultants to ensure that the voices of those who had suffered discrimination would be heard and that their testimonies would be given weight in shaping the hotel's new policies. As the investigation progressed, several members of the management team faced serious scrutiny. The general manager, whose indifference during the meeting had been evident, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. The supervisor, who had repeatedly sided with wealthy guests over staff, was also suspended, and her email correspondence was used as part of the investigation. It became clear that there were patterns of neglect and favoritism that extended far beyond what had been initially disclosed. Meanwhile, the hotel's most influential guests, including Richard Whitman and Henry Caldwell, found themselves in an uncomfortable spotlight. Their names were now associated with the publicized allegations of racism and discrimination at the hotel, and this association began to affect their own reputations. Some media outlets picked up the story, publishing articles that included snippets from the recordings Marcus had presented at the meeting. Whitman and Caldwell, despite their initial bravado, quickly sought to distance themselves from the controversy. As pressure mounted, the senior owner took further action. She announced a series of new policies aimed at addressing the problems Marcus had highlighted. These included mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff, the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for employees to file grievances without fear of retaliation, and a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, regardless of a guest's status or influence. The most controversial change was the introduction of rules that applied directly to guests. Moving forward, any guest found to be treating staff in a disrespectful or discriminatory manner would be subject to penalties, including revocation of privileges or even a permanent ban from the hotel. The senior owner was firm in her stance. No amount of money should excuse bad behavior. She stated during a press conference, "This hotel will not tolerate racism, elitism, or any form of discrimination." These new measures were met with mixed reactions. Some guests applauded the hotel's commitment to creating a more inclusive atmosphere, while others complained that the policies were an overreach. Marcus, however, knew that these changes were necessary, even if they were met with resistance. He had seen firsthand the damage caused by allowing wealthy patrons to believe they were above the rules, and he was determined to ensure that those days were over. As for Marcus himself, his role within the hotel began to shift. He continued to be involved in the reform efforts, but he also started to receive invitations to speak at conferences and workshops on corporate ethics and diversity. His story of working undercover to expose bias had garnered attention beyond the hotel, and many were interested in hearing how one person could make a difference in such a large and entrenched system. Back at the hotel, the culture slowly began to change. The new training programs emphasized the importance of empathy, respect, and equality, and staff members who had previously been overlooked found their contributions being recognized. Employees who had been hesitant to voice their concerns now felt empowered to speak up, knowing that there were systems in place to protect them. Several weeks later, as the reforms continued to take shape, Marcus was approached by some of the employees he had supported during the investigation. They expressed their gratitude for what he had done, not just for them, but for future staff members who would benefit from the changes. It was a humbling experience for Marcus, who knew that he had not acted alone. The courage of those who had shared their stories and stood with him during the meeting had been just as vital to bringing about change. One afternoon, while Marcus was in the lobby discussing ongoing projects with a colleague, he noticed Whitman entering the hotel. His presence was unexpected, given the circumstances, and Marcus could see the discomfort in Whitman's demeanor as he approached. Whitman cleared his throat. "Marcus," he began, his voice uncharacteristically subdued, "I just wanted to acknowledge what happened. I suppose I didn't see things as clearly as I should have, and, well, I hope things improve here." It wasn't an apology, not in the true sense, but it was the closest thing to a concession that Whitman was likely to offer. Marcus met his gaze, his expression calm. "I hope things improve too," he replied, "for everyone." Whitman nodded awkwardly and walked away, leaving Marcus to reflect on the encounter. It wasn't vindication, nor did it erase the hurt caused by people like Whitman, but it was a sign that the message had been received, that the days of casual prejudice without consequence were ending. Caldwell, on the other hand, made no such gesture. He had ceased visiting the hotel altogether, likely choosing to stay away from a place where his behavior had come under scrutiny. To Marcus, Caldwell's absence was no loss. If anything, it reinforced the idea that those who could not respect the hotel's values were not welcome. In the months that followed, Marcus remained committed to the reform process, ensuring that the changes implemented were not just temporary fixes, but foundational shifts in the hotel's culture. He worked to expand the diversity and inclusion initiatives across the entire chain, knowing that the problems he had encountered at this location were not unique. It became his mission to use his experience as a catalyst for widespread change within the industry. As the hotel adapted to its new policies, Marcus saw a noticeable transformation in the way guests and staff interacted. The atmosphere grew warmer and more inclusive, and employees of all backgrounds began to feel a sense of belonging. The hotel's reputation, initially threatened by the scandal, began to recover as word spread about the proactive steps taken to address the issues. One evening, as Marcus walked through the hotel's lobby, he saw a familiar face, the bellboy who had once been reprimanded unjustly. The young man approached Marcus with a smile. "Mr. Marcus," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. Things really are different now, and it's because of what you did." Marcus returned the smile. "It wasn't just me," he replied. "It was all of us, together." The bellboy nodded, his expression earnest. "Still, it wouldn't have happened without you taking that first step." As Marcus continued his walk, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. It had taken months of preparation, courage, and persistence to bring about change, but it was finally happening. The hotel, once a place where discrimination was quietly tolerated, had become a symbol of progress and fairness. Marcus's journey had not been an easy one, but it had been worth it. He had confronted prejudice, exposed the truth, and helped rebuild the hotel's culture from the ground up. And although there would always be challenges ahead, he knew that the most important battles had been won. The path to justice was never straight, but it was a path worth walking. And now it was a path that others would be able to follow, thanks to the stand he had taken. Thank you for watching to the end. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Also, check out the other videos on our channel. There are equally interesting stories waiting for you. Subscribe and stay tuned.